Prologue. Misu Ando awoke from a dream in which he was sinking into the sea. The trilling of the telephone insinuated itself into the sound of the surf, and the next minute he was jerked into a wakefulness, as though the waves had taken him. He stretched his arm out over the side of the bed and picked up the receiver. Hello? He waited, but no sound came through the line. Hello? He said again, sternly this time, urging the caller to reply. There came a woman's voice, so morose it made him shudder. Did you get it? The voice filled Ando with fatigue. He felt as if he were being dragged into a dark ditch. The dream from which he'd just awakened flashed before his eyes. A huge wave had suddenly sucked him up off a beach. As he sank to the bottom of the sea, he lost all sense of up or down, right or left, until he was helpless against the current. As always, he'd felt a tiny hand grasping at his shin. Every time he had the dream, he felt on his feet the touch of that little hand, those anemone-like fingers slipping away to vanish into the depths of the ocean. There was absolutely nothing he could do to prevent it, and it tortured him. He stretched out his arms, sure that he should be able to reach the body, but he just couldn't get a grip on it. It eluded his grasp every time, leaving behind only a few soft, fine strands of hair. The woman's voice reminded him of the unpleasant vividness of the soft feel of that hair. Yes, it arrived, Ando answered, annoyed. The form for their divorce. It had arrived 2 or 3 days ago, with his wife's signature and seal already affixed. All Ando had to do was sign it and stamp his own seal on it, and the paper would have fulfilled the purpose of its existence. But he hadn't done it yet. And there was a weariness in his wife's voice as she prodded him. How could she be so blasé about putting an end to 7 years of married life? And what? I want you to sign it, stamp it, and return it to me. Ando shook his head. How many times had he tried to make it clear to her? He wanted to start over, but every time he told her so, she would set terms he couldn't meet, as if to prove to him the strength of their determination. He'd been perfectly willing to give up all self-respect and grovel, but lately he was getting a bit tired of even that. All right, I'll do what you want. Ando surprised himself, giving in so easily. His wife was silent for a moment and then rasped, I think you owe me an explanation. About what? It was a stupid response. About what you did to me. Still clutching the receiver, Ando squeezed his eyes shut. Is she going to harangue me every morning even after she gets her divorce? It was a crushing thought. It was my fault, but he said it too easily, without putting feeling into the words, and that set her off. You never cared for him. You're talking nonsense. Listen to yourself. Well then why? Don't ask. You already know the answer. How could you do such a thing? Her voice trembled, a harbinger of the frenzy she was warming up to. He wanted to tell her to never call again and then slammed down the receiver, but he restrained himself. This was the least he could do. The only reparation he could offer was to silently bear his wife's recriminations, to allow her to vent her grief. Say something! She was in tears now. Like what? For 1 year and 3 months now we've talked about nothing else. There's nothing left to say. Give him back to me! It was a cry of pain, totally devoid of reason. He didn't need to ask whom she wanted back. Ando wanted him back too. It was what he'd been praying for every day, knowing full well how useless it was. Bring him back! I beg you, give him back! I can't, he said simply, trying to calm her down. I want him back! He couldn't bear to hear his wife like this, wrapped up in past misery, unwilling to start a new life. Ando was trying, at least, to live a little more constructively. There was no recovering what was lost, and he'd done his utmost to repair the marriage, to convince her to think about the new life they'd had if they could. He didn't want to get divorced over this. He was prepared to do anything. It would be worth it if only they could again be happy couple they'd once been. But his wife didn't want to look to the future, and she blamed him for everything. Give him back! What more do you want me to do? You don't know what you've done! Ando sighed loudly enough to be heard from the other end of the line. She was repeating the same barren phrases. Her nerves were clearly fraying. He wanted to introduce her to a psychiatrist friend of his, but his wife's father was a doctor, the head of the hospital. She'd just take it as a meddling. I'm hanging up now. That's it. Run away like you always do. I want you to forget this, to get over it. He knew it was useless, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. Ando started to put down the receiver. As he did, a cry of desperation came from the earpiece. I want you to bring Takanori back! Even after he'd hung up, the name kept spilling from the receiver until its echo filled the room. Without knowing, Ando was muttering it to himself. Takanori, Takanori, Takanori. Ando lay unmoving on the bed for a while, curled up in a fetal position, head in his hands. Then he glanced at the clock, and he knew he couldn't stay that way forever. It was time to leave for work. Ando unplugged the phone from the wall jack so she couldn't call back, then went to stand by the window. When he opened it to get rid of some of the gloom, he heard the cry of a crow. They always flew over from Yoyogi Park to perch on the power lines, but this one sounded closer than usual. It gave him a start, but the avian cry, airy and expansive, also lightened his mood. It was such a contrast to the black depths of the oceans of his dreams, and to the desperate cries of his wives for their son. It was Saturday morning, a clear autumn day. Maybe it was wonderful weather rubbing him the wrong way, but tears welled up in his eyes. He blew his nose. He was alone in his studio apartment. He collapsed back onto the bed. He thought he managed to fight back the tears, but now they came streaming out of the corners of his eyes. Soon he was sobbing, hugging his pillow and calling his son's name. He hated himself for falling apart like that. Grief's visits weren't regular. It waited until something set it off, and then it kept on coming. He hadn't wept for his son for a couple of weeks, although the hiatus between his crying spells was getting longer. When the sadness did come, it was just as deep as ever. How long was this going to continue? He could hardly bear to wonder. Ando took an envelope out from between the two books on the shelf and withdrew from it several tangled strands of hair. They were all that was left, physically, of his son. His hand had brushed the child's head, and when he tried to pull on the boy toward him, these strands had come off. It was some kind of miracle that they'd stayed stuck on his hand all the while he'd been thrashing about in the ocean. They'd gotten twisted around his wedding ring. The body never surfaced. They had been unable to have a proper cremation. The lock of hair was Ando's only relic of his boy. Ando held the strands to his cheek and recalled the touch of his son's skin. When he closed his eyes, Takanori came back to life in his mind. Ando could almost believe the boy was right there. When he finished brushing his teeth, he just stood in front of the mirror, naked from the waist up. He put his hand to his jaw and rubbed it lightly. He felt the back of his teeth with his tongue. There was still a little plaque clinging to them. He saw a spot on his neck just below his chin that the razor had missed. He brought the razor up to his neck and shaved off the little stumps of beard, and then froze, arrested by his own reflection. He raised his jaw and looked at his pale neck outstretched in the mirror. He shifted his grip on the razor and brought the back of it to the base of his throat, then slowly lowered it from his neck to his chest, then down to his midriff, finally resting it near his navel. A white line ran along the surface of his flesh between his nipples down to his belly. Imagining the razor was a scalpel, he pictured dissecting his own body. Ando spent these days cutting corpses open, so he knew perfectly well what he'd find inside his chest. His fist-sized heart set cradled between two pink lungs that was beating firmly. If he concentrated, he could almost hear it. But that persistent pain in his chest, where in his innards did sorrow lodge, was it the heart? He wanted with his bare hands to scoop out the clump of remorse. The razor felt as if it were going to slip on his sweaty skin, so he put it down on the shelf over the sink. He turned his head to see a thin line of blood on the right side of his throat. He nicked himself. He should have felt a little stab of pain where the edge of the blade bit into the skin, but as he stared at the blood, it felt nothing. He was lately growing numb to physical pain. Several times already he'd only learned he'd been hurt after seeing the wound. Maybe he was losing his passion for life. He pressed a towel to his neck and picked up his watch. 8:30. He'd better leave for work. His job was only a salvation these days. Only by immersing himself in work could he elude the clutch of his memories. Ando, a lecturer in forensic medicine at Fukuoka University Medical School, was also a coroner for the Tokyo Medical Examiner's Office. Only when he was conducting an autopsy could he forget the death of his beloved son. Ironically, playing with dead bodies released him from the death that had touched him. He left his apartment. As he walked through the lobby of the building, looking at his watch, a habit, he was 5 minutes behind schedule. The 5 minutes he'd taken to sign and stamp the writ of divorce. In a mere 5 minutes, the bond that had connected him to his wife had been severed. He was aware of the 3 mailboxes between his apartment and the university. Ando made up his mind and dropped the envelope into the first one along the way. He hurried off to the train station.